I just want to welcome everyone to our workshop today. Our workshop today is titled Healthy Attachment and Violence Prevention Through Body Sovereignty. Our trainers, our presenters, our knowledge holders today, we have Beata Tsosie Peña, who is the organizational director from Breath of My Heart Birthplace. They are from Santa Clara Pueblo and El Rito, New Mexico. She's an organizational director for Breath of My Heart Birthplace and is traditional Kapo'o Owenge territory in Hispaniola, New Mexico. She is a certified in infant massage, as a developmental specialist, an educator, a lactation counselor, a full spectrum birth worker, and an indigenous sustainable design, parentheses, permaculture. She is also a Pueblo representative for the New Mexico Governor's Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Relatives Task Force and is serving her second term. She has been working to address impacts and advocate for environmental and reproductive health and justice for over a decade. Thank you so much for being here with us, Beata. We also have Belin Marcus, who is the clinical director from Birth of My Heart Birthplace, and she is from northern New Mexico, from the village of Okeowenge, translated from Tewa as Place of the Strong People. As a Pueblo woman, she, like many, have felt the impact of colonization in her search for women's health and reproductive wellness. As a single mother, she learned to practice teaching the feminine principle and sought to provide her daughter with autonomy, wisdom of plants and prayer, healthy reproductive living, and self-determination. Belin was able to learn the art of midwifery with a preceptor in a traditional home birth style. She is the first licensed midwife from the village in New Mexico and hopes to rekindle the practice of midwifery in Native communities. Belin is also a massage therapist and enjoys incorporating body work into her practice. And she looks forward to the day when reproductive health is something taught in the communities as a part of our way of life. And our co-moderator is also Chastity Salvador, and I just want to let folks know she will also be supporting Beata. And with that, I will pass that over to you, Beata.
Thank you, Jolene. Hello, everyone. I'm Singing Te'iri. Na huahiwa ovi. Tewa ohawe na hapo owinge omu. Na ke'atoa omu. It's great to be here. I really appreciate you all taking the time to join us and have this conversation. We'll get right into it. We have a PowerPoint that we're going to pull up. So Belin, if you want to share that on your screen, we can get started. And at any time, if you all have questions or anything, we want to just really encourage dialogue format and sharing. I know there's a lot of expertise in the group here, so please feel free to share and add to what we talk about today at any time.
Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see you all. Okay, so I have one here from Latricia. I believe that's how you say your name. Body sovereignty is important to me because it gives empowerment to individuals and communities. That's a great one. I have one from Alicia Coris. Body sovereignty is important to me because our bodies are sacred and play a foundational role for our kinship and future actions.
Okay, so Belin and I are from Breath of My Heart Birthplace, Naviping Ha Umu, which was a name bestowed on us by Tewa grandmothers in the community. It's a term of endearment for children when they're born or when they're growing, anytime that you're the breath of my heart. So breath of my heart is a direct translation from that phrase. Belin and I came on as co-directors recently with Breath of My Heart, so that's been an exciting transition to have our birth center become Indigenous led. Can do next slide. So and back to like a little bit about Breath of My Heart. We are a freestanding birth center and home birth midwifery practice. And we also have a free walk-in clinic. We do food distribution, young parent support group. And so just wanted to let you know a little bit of background. And I don't know, Belin, if you have anything to add about the birth center and the services we provide.
We have a free walk-in clinic on Mondays. We have a young parents group that meets every 2 weeks. We right now currently have one midwife, and we're hoping to hire a couple more midwives so that we can get some students, specifically target the northern New Mexico area for indigenous communities. I think that's about it.
Yeah, so feel free to contact us if you need any services or you want to spread the word for anyone you think might need free reproductive health support. So before we start into the presentation, we are going to be talking about things that are hard and some about historical trauma and colonialism to give some of the context of why we are facing some of the disparities that we do today around this issue of attachment and having to advocate for body sovereignty. So this is an overview of what we're going to talk about a little bit today. And we already introduced ourselves. I'm glad you all are introducing each other's in the chat. We're going to go over a little bit more on body sovereignty, talking about historical trauma and attachment disruption, how that led into the current impacts that we're facing today, talking about healthy attachment with babies and early childhood and families and what that looks like, a little bit on home births and some on lactation and first foods, and then on infant cues and the benefits of healthy touch. And a little short resource list that we welcome additions to. So this is just a little overview. Everything we're going to be talking about is like really general. So we're not going to go too much in depth into anyone. Like each one of these could probably be its own workshop on its own. So that's why we want to really feel free that if there's anything really important that you think we need to go deeper in, or like you want to share, you feel called to share on, like we really encourage that, because this is more really just the kind of general discussion about these things. But if there's anything you have questions or want to go a little bit deeper, we're open to that too. So you can look in the chat for what you all are talking about with this. And so for me, like body sovereignty is thinking about like, well, if my body was a sovereign nation, and what would that look like for myself? And it's an interesting question to really reflect and think about, like, do we really have that, in our lived reality? And I've seen questions of like, an example would be to think about like how many times a day you're maybe touched by another person without your consent, or what are your different boundaries that you have in conversation or in your time or space, and how that can be so drastically different, like with our own family members or just in community, and thinking about how that's respected, even in our families and in cultural contexts where sometimes it's not a guarantee that just because it's family that's going to be respected, so I know there is cultural contexts that come with consent, a certain level of consent. And so this isn't to say that we need to be like worried about all touch is bad from our family, or if there's already a certain level of affection that's normalized, like that's healthy. There's healthy interactions, and so it's like recognizing those gut feelings that we get in our thoughts and heart and in our gut, our stomach, that sometimes can cue us into when things don't feel good or when things are uncomfortable. So I was thinking about cultural context, for example, like when we do our traditional namings for our babies, and I'm giving my baby to one of the aunties to name, and they're going to do their ceremony with that. There's things that I'm aware is going to happen but there's also a level of trust, and I'm there witnessing and making sure, you know. And so I've also heard stories of, in cultural context with medicine people, where there was discomfort or often even harm caused. And so we have that ability to always assert our sovereignty and what those boundaries are, you know, and so we can start to think about that and how we can advocate for things to get better, and how to help our community learn to put these things into practice. And I'll let Belin talk about the rest of them.
Yeah. So, you know, ongoing education is really important, you know, talking to your children when they're little, or your grandchildren or nieces, nephews, nibblings, you know, just starting that conversation when they're really young, and knowing that you can communicate without words, you know, you can communicate with physical gestures as well, or that we communicate with physical gestures. And you know, sometimes you lean in to kiss your children or grandchildren and they turn away, you know, that's them saying that they don't want that affection, or they're not consenting to what you're offering them. So, you know, just talking to them, and to, you know, parents of children and other people in the community, that education is ongoing. And then giving children the agency and giving them the choice of their autonomy, and being able to decide for themselves what it is that they want or they don't want. And you know, some examples of that would be, you know, like getting dressed in the morning, instead of picking their clothes out for them, letting them pick out their own clothes, even if they're mismatched, you know, just let them go for it. Let them have that autonomy to choose what it is that they want for that day. And you know, also teaching compromise in some of those situations, I think, is important, as an education about body sovereignty, and, you know, knowing when compromise is okay and when it's not okay. And then modeling the consent and the choice. You know, I use myself as an example a lot. I have 2 grandchildren. One is 4 and one is 1.5 years. And you know, it's interesting for me to be able to educate the older child, my grandson, the 4-year-old, and how to respect his sister's boundaries that she's setting when he's trying to give her a big old bear hug, because he's like so much bigger than she is, and she's like, no, or like, ah. And you know, making sure that he's aware that that's not okay, like she's telling you to back off. And the same with her. And you know, he doesn't want to share his toys. Okay, well, you need to respect that he doesn't want to share toys right now. And modeling for him also, like giving her a few of what he's playing with, so she's not just trying to grab what he has. You know, that relationship is all consent. It's all sovereignty about what they're doing in their little micro lives, and showing them, being an example for them.
And to add more on the ongoing education, so it's like sometimes we think about like having the talk with our children, you know, and it's like really you want to have lots of talks as you go through life together, and normalize those conversations, from, you know, from different levels of, like, when they're younger, you might want to not go into so much detail, but making sure that you're building off the knowledge that they have as they get older. And here's an example of just that normalized affection that happens in family systems, of Belin and her kids and their beautiful clothing. And so how do we nurture body sovereignty starting from infancy and into early childhood? We're going to emphasize this first point over and over of support for parents and families. It's a crisis right now how families are not supported, especially if they're first-time parents, if they're, if for whatever reason there was disruption in their families, or they're still trying to heal from negative family patterns, then it's really crucial that there's community support, that there's institutional support to step in and help them in whatever area. And so thinking about how we really build that safety net in our communities, so that people aren't falling through the cracks when they need it, and that we're able to help families that are struggling for whatever reasons. It could be minor and it could be more urgent things, you know, but that knowing that unfortunately we are still in a time when we have to fill in the gaps with the disparities in our systems of support. And so I really see community stepping up in a good way. And part of that could be like, if you're going and working with a family in any capacity, you know, we can help to teach these things. We could all get trained as birth workers and lactation counselors, and, you know, just like really building our knowledge base of how we can step in, building our network so that we're able to like direct people to, if we can't provide that, directing them to who can, you know. And again, just like really modeling that culture of consent with each other and with our young people. And with families, like, you know, in my environmental background, we're always just advocating for free, informed, prior consent with issues. And it doesn't matter what the issue is. That's a good model to go by. You know, does the family have all the information do they need to make the decisions? And then what are they consenting to? And sometimes we have to step in as advocates to like, hey, I don't know if you really understood what was just told, explained to you, or you know, like, do you need more time? And like learning these tools of how to like ask for more time, ask for more, you know, ask all the questions you need. Because a lot of times when we're in situations where there's kind of learned power dynamics, like with the doctor or in a birth setting, or teacher-student relationships, you know, there's internalized power dynamics that we're also trying to unpack a little bit in how these dynamics play out. And so making sure that everyone has consent. And then being conscious of things that we can make, maybe consciously or unconsciously perpetuate and holding up harmful systems. So things around gender and sex stereotypes. Are we squashing body sovereignty and autonomy by our own internalized biases of what we think that our children should be as soon as they're born, you know, and really like thinking about that. A lot of myths and prejudices. Is there heteronormativity that we're perpetuating? Is there toxic masculinity with around, even starting from a young age with, oh, boys don't play with those things, or like, you know, just like these kind of stereotypical things that sometimes it's just, we're not even really conscious of how we perpetuate them. So working on learning about what these stereotypes look like and how they can play out, and stepping in. And sometimes it's another opportunity for advocacy with either in their schools or in our families, you know, of just like, oh, well, you know, we really believe that like kids can play with whatever they want, and that doesn't matter, you know, or just however we want to start practicing that languaging. And knowing that these interactions will allow for them to expect it throughout their lives. For some of us, we had to learn that we can assert this for ourselves later in life, you know, and then the earlier they experience this, they're more able to assert it in their interactions, and also as a prevention measure for like the way they communicate with others. Do you have anything to add about this, Belin?
No, we can go on to the next
Okay, and maybe now's a good time to ask if anybody in the group has anything to add about anything so far, or any questions so far.
Yeah, or if there's anything in the chat that anybody wants to share.
Beata, this is Jolene. I have a question. So you're talking about like the consciousness of gender and sex stereotypes. How would you start that conversation with like your children? Or when do you think that should happen?
Well, I'm really conscious of it now. For me, it was even just like when I was my journey as a birth worker, like when a baby's born, what's the first thing folks usually do? You know, oh, it's a girl, it's a boy, you know, and maybe just like being like, how can we just like be in the moment with like letting them express who they are, or like sitting with that, where we don't have to try and define things for others with our own perception. I think like with my kids, it's always been like, oh, there's really no such thing as boy and girl colors. There's really no such thing as toys. You know, you can play with what you want. You can wear what you want. A lot around in like tribal communities, I see a lot of buy-in with like that toxic masculinity, you know, of wanting little boys to be macho and squash their emotions. And so how are we encouraging children to be their full selves from as young an age as possible? Expressing themselves, either it's like, yeah, you want to decorate your body, like we all have that need, right? We all want to like wear jewelry and like be expressive on our clothes. And that knowing a lot of these things are colonial constructs, you know, they weren't part of our traditional communities. So I think it's something that you could start at a young age. When I was a preschool teacher, we had lots of kids that like just got into the dress up box, you know, and wore what they wanted, and it was fine. And so I don't think there's like any age. I think like the trick with kids is trying not to go into too much detail to overwhelm them about things, but just like see if they're satisfied with the response, and if they need more information, and always keeping it open, like, oh, if you want to talk about this more, we can. There's books now that like can help normalize these conversations. So we're finally like starting to have more resources to talk about these things. Does that help answer your question?
Yes, it does. And I'll pass it to Chastity, because it looks like Chastity put a definition of what body sovereignty means.
Thank you. I was just putting my thoughts of what body sovereignty means, answering the earlier question. But to me, it's thank you for mentioning this earlier, Beata, about your work with environmental justice and how the idea of informed consent and informed choices for ourselves is you know, connected, I think, across the board between birth work and environmental justice work. And it's yeah, that concept I think is like relevant across the board. And so ways that I think of sovereignty, and you know, it's interesting, like growing up in Pueblo country, Pueblo schooling, like we say we have sovereignty, but I've always questioned that, because I'm like, I don't know if Pueblos have sovereignty, or we have sovereignty over ourselves. And we're seeing that a lot, you know, with the ways that New Mexico, or the state of New Mexico, or the ways that water is being managed currently, and how we're not on the same page as farmers, as ditch bosses, as just people who see the impacts of climate change on water. So yeah, like a solution-based thinking is like, okay, how do we create coalitions, right, to all be on the same page? But yeah, and I'm like, that's like the sovereignty piece. That's like the piece is being, you know, one voice and having informed choices on what we're going to do with our bodies, or what we're going to do with our reproductive health, which I put in the chat, and the health of our waters and seeds and lands. Yeah, that's just like where my thoughts are. I don't want to take too much time.
That's fine, we have time, thank you. Yeah, I think I've heard elders say that were former tribal officials, that we only have sovereignty as far as we assert it. you know, and so if we're not asserting our sovereignty, whether it's through governance or as individuals, then that's the question of like, well, do we really have it if we're not asserting it? Okay, so going into some of the historical context of what we want to talk about. We might be at different levels of learning on colonial history in our land base. And so our communities have gone through so much. And here in New Mexico, we've gone through 3 waves of colonial violence. Let me pull up my notes on this. And this is an ongoing issue with tribal and global indigenous peoples, you know, to where there was a campaign of genocide and extermination of Native peoples that was, you know, across generations. It was not discriminatory. It was entire families and communities. I know in New Mexico we had over 1,000 pueblos at one time, you know, and now we're down to 22 sovereign nations. So that's an example of that extermination agenda. And then part of how colonialism works is that upheaval of our traditional life ways. And usually our food systems were the first to get attacked. Things that they knew gave us strength as peoples were the things that would get targeted. So that included our matrilineal ways of knowing. For my own people, I'm going to say we are a matrilineal society, but that we were forced to adopt a patriarchal form of governance in society before the colonizers would even practice any semblance of diplomacy with our communities. There was also an intentional disruption of our economies, so our ways of being in relation with other tribal nations. We see that now in the disruption with our relatives in the South, to where the borders are becoming increasingly militarized. And then that moved into the boarding school era, you know, the forceful removal and separation of Native children from their families, and the forced displacement and relocation of tribal peoples from their lands, their ecologies, and their culture. I'm always reflect on how as Pueblo peoples, because of the Pueblo revolt, we were able to remain on our ancestral lands. And that wasn't the case for a lot of tribal nations who are still trying to end that struggle for literal land back, and also for access to traditional places. And I know that's an issue with us with environmental justice issues, to where we're slowly getting pushed out of even our sacred sites, you know, through extraction industries, through militarization. And so this isn't something that like ended in the past, it's just taken on different forms. And the boarding school era, that was 5 generations that went through this. I think it continued into the 1950s. And even today, there's a disproportionate amount of Native children removed from their families through the children and family services and into the foster systems. So we can see how a lot of these practices never really ended. And even with physical genocide, there's still global indigenous peoples going through this that happened in our lifetime. And what that is that created that pattern, that original trauma of disrupted attachment in our families, you know, to where I see a lot of Native families that have talked about skin hunger and lack of affection or lack of passing on of knowledge in our families, because a lot of these tactics were partially successful, you know, and how those things were disrupted pretty severely. This is a example of the burning schools. Next slide. And so some more on like how this kind of went into what we're talking about more with like reproductive justice and our matrilineal ways. And so the militarism, we can see that now in my homelands. There's nuclear weapons production in our ancestral cultural sites in our homelands. You know, there's still the militarization of native lands, where there's spaces next to native communities. That led into, once the military campaigns of genocide ended, then there was this shift to the agenda of forced assimilation, which is the killing of cultural, language, and spiritual practices. And with our matrilineal ways, you know, I know for us, property used to be owned and passed on to through to our daughters. We had a lot more representation in our governance and in our councils, and just the way our economies were managed, the way crops were managed, the way the finances were kind of shared, you know, that was, those things all shifted really dramatically, as well as our practices around marriage, birth, and death in the communities, when these ways were suppressed. And in order for colonizer values and systems to take power, these things had to be actively suppressed. And so then there was actual shaming of our traditional healers and midwives in the community, to the point of criminalization. So once, you know, and this is all simultaneous with the enslavement of Black communities as well, and the oppression of Black women. And we have to like keep that in mind, and we have to build that Black and Indigenous solidarity with these issues, because there was like so many things happening, not only to Native peoples, but you know, this ongoing atrocities. And so when like the modern OB and gynecological practices came into function, there was that shaming of our traditional midwives and healers, to where it was illegal. And I've heard stories of nurses and hospitals that were turning in, if they heard of Black midwives or Native midwives practicing, they would turn them in and they would get arrested. To the point where we stopped having home births in our communities. Then IHS comes in, right, into our communities. And we start going there, and we start like getting told these narratives of that were just did a lot of harm, and how, again, of how that knowledge didn't get passed on, but also really limiting the access of Black and Indigenous and people of colors to access these forms of healing for their own people. So that also led into the era of forced sterilization of our communities. It was really intensive during the 70s, and it was something between 42% of Native women between the ages of 15 to 40 years old were the ones targeted for forced sterilization during the 70s. And there's evidence that like 4 of the 12 IHS services in the regions did practice these sterilizations on Native women. Black and Latino women were also targeted without their consent. And there's even stories going in the present day of this still happening. And then that coming more into the present day as well, there's the monetized, capitalized hospital birthing, to where our healthcare system became a for-profit industry. Not something that's a human right deserving of all people in equity, but became a capitalistic endeavor. And this is really problematic because we know that like current IHS facilities are consistently underfunded and there's constantly funding being cut. I know recently in the last decade, a lot of OB services were terminated in IHS facilities. And again, this is all happening during the Jim Crow era of segregation and violence with Black communities. Belin, you want to talk about formula campaigns?
Yeah, so I just want to mention we're coming up on an hour. So we'll take a break after this and just ground ourselves and just take care of ourselves in the way that we need. So the formula campaigns, the BIPOC communities are targeted specifically in telling us that our bodies don't work properly, that we need to give our babies formula, and looking back generationally over the past few generations, that was really common practice. It was normalized to have bottle feeding, and one of the things that they did were to have campaigns that targeted the BIPOC communities, and they aren't regulated, like the advertising and commercials aren't regulated, so they can promote it in any way that they choose. The infant mortality, you can see here that the white infants are 4.67%, Native and Alaskan infants 9.21%, and Black infants 10.9%. And so you can see the big gap in the infant mortality rates across the nation. And in midwifery, right now in the United States, we have 87% more white midwives than Native American or any other midwives. They're the majority. And even in New Mexico, it's about the same percentage, where there, or maybe even more than that, of CPMs or certified professional midwives as opposed to CNMs, certified nurse midwives. The difference being that CPMs or LMs are trained through a different type of programming. They're not nurses. We are not nurses. And there's a very small handful that are BIPOC, and the majority are white midwives. So what's having to happen is that the white midwives are now teaching us what we taught them, several generations ago, what they learned from our people, what they capitalized on by removing it from our communities. Now they're like selling it back to us, right? Which is, again, a disparity in and of itself. I wanted to open it up for questions. I saw Chastity put in the chat asking if there were more BIPOC LMs than white midwives, I think was the question. And the answer is no, it's very white dominant. The midwives across the nation right now are white midwives. So it's something that I'm hoping we can reclaim in the next 10 years or so, and really tip the scales on that number.
There's a high amount of Hispanic, Latina identified midwives that are around that 80 percentile, but not for Black and Indigenous.
Are there any other questions or comments about the past several slides that we went over, or the conversation that we've been having? You can just unmute yourself or raise your hand with the emoji if you have anything.
Actually, you just got a question.
Cool.
From Dolores. So midwives are different from doulas?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, doulas are support birth. They're there to help advocate for the birthing person, and are very much needed in the hospital for negotiating with doctors and nurses about, you know, making sure that the birthing person's body autonomy is being respected and what their birth plan is, helping them through the stages of labor. A midwife is more medical. So we're trained very similarly to what the OBs do. Our scope of work is basically the same, except for medications, C-sections, but we are trained to do well women's, well women's care, as well as prenatal, postpartum, and birth. And we are also similar to doulas in a way, in a sense that we stay with the birthing parent through their labor. Sometimes if we have a lot of clients in one, in like a short period of time, in a time frame, we might spend a little less time with the client than we normally would, but and some midwives really like to be there from beginning to end. Some midwives will come in at active labor and stay through the remainder from active labor to 2 to 4 hours postpartum. Another difference that we have is we follow our client through the postpartum period for up to 6 weeks, and the newborn as well. So we'll get a little more into that when we go over home birth.
Go ahead and pull it up. And just to add on to that a little bit while you pull up the PowerPoint again, that there's a, like I refer to myself as a birth worker instead of doula, just because of the cultural context doesn't really translate for me, with doula being a Greek word. And so we're, yeah, just that spiritual, physical, cultural support for pregnant families. But you might hear people refer interchangeably between like birth worker, which a lot of Native communities don't really differentiate between like midwife and doula in that way. But there is a difference with what Belin was talking about. So with this slide, wanting to, I refer to myself as a birth worker, just to like come back from that that historical context to like, again, thinking about those strengths that we come from, and how we're reclaiming these things that were suppressed in our communities. And so Belin, I was hoping you could like bring us back a little bit and into that hopefulness of, you know, your journey as being the first TEWA certified midwife in our state in probably 100 years, which is amazing.
Sure. I'm gonna not share while I'm talking about that, just because it's a little weird to like have this slide up and then like not see people, you know what I mean, like communicating with people. So I'm gonna stop the share screen for a little bit. But so in the state of New Mexico, and I'm sure it's pretty similar in the country, midwifery wasn't regulated like say 100 years ago. It only became regulated in the 60s, in the 1960s. And so what happened was that in 40 years or 50 years, there were more than 1,000 midwives in the state of New Mexico. And when regulation happened, that number went to 0. So I'm the first Native licensed midwife in the state of New Mexico. And like I said, in the 1960s is when it became regulated. So it took from the 1960s to 2018 for us to have a Native licensed midwife. You know, that's one of my big dreams is to really repopulate our communities with midwives, because, you know, as as we historically, like Beata said, we didn't have a differentiation of what a birth worker was. Our aunties, our grandmas, our ko'os, our, you know, our nieces, and just everybody was part of that birth world. And it was supported by those people, you know, whether it was the pregnancy process, the preconception process, you know, like the fertility of it, our whole cycle, our whole reproductive cycle, you know, we were all a part of that together as a community historically. And now it's become very divided, and, you know, like, you know, we talk about birth worker or being the difference between a doula and a midwife. And I really, you know, those lines are really hard sometimes to like get beyond. But you know, I want to see that collective happen again. And I get excited about that. And,
Yeah. And there's so much interest, and I see so many Indigenous up and coming birth workers that are getting trained. And again, it's these are things that everyone can be knowledgeable about, and just being conscious of families in our communities of like, how can we support them, you know? And it's taking food, taking them, like helping with some chores, helping financially, you know, but also like in the sustainability of midwifery in our communities is like how we used to take care of our birth workers too, in an economic way. When I talk about that those economic systems that were in place, so people that provided these needs for our communities, they were also taken care of, you know. And so that's a question that that I have now in my role with the birth center, is like, what is the sustainability of birth workers in Native communities, and that reciprocity between what we're providing and how that's supported, you know. And so there's a lot of work to be done in supporting birth workers in our communities, but also in access for students, because Belin's right, you did have to have a level of privilege to even just access the learning around it when all these policies were in place.
just as we're, you know, here today talking about attachment and lactation, it's similar to all those relationships that we've had historically in our communities. That attachment was there by supporting each other, the way Beata was talking about, in the economics of it, in the simple tasks of, you know, going to do chores and supporting the parents to bond with the baby, especially in those initial weeks that, you know, soon after that they are born.
So secure attachment is really foundational and important between a caregiver and the children. It supports their mental, physical, emotional, and social development. That's important because, and then it's also impacts learning and brain development. With brain development, it nurtures that like frontal cortex, which is all about decision making, judgments, reasoning skills. So you can see like you can see that in our interactions, that like if you didn't have that as a child, like we struggle with that as adults, you know, and on different levels of extremes. So think about what the opposite of these examples would be and how we see that in our communities, you know. So how do we relate with others? How do we trust others? What is our emotional response and reaction to things that come up? How are we, how can they self-regulate their emotions? Problem-solving skills, sense of self, and a good self-esteem. These are all really tied to secure attachment with caregivers. And so some important elements that can help to nurture bonding and attachment with baby and parent is like good eye contact, skin contact, vocalization, whether it's singing, talking. We all get that little high-pitched baby voice that, oh, look at that baby. Baby's response to parent, that activation of maternal and paternal hormones by contact with babies, temperature regulation, there's even immunizing bacteria that's transferred to the baby by close contact with parents that actually impacts like how they're able to do these regulation. Caregiver, and then that relationship, that caregiver and infant dance with each other, where they're those constant interactions that are helping to form that secure attachment. You know, so these are all things that you can look for, like when working with families, or like, are these things happening with a new parent? And you know, and if not, then that could be like red flags that maybe there's support needed. And here's what it looks like. You know, so the parent is responsive and warm. If the baby has needs, that the caregiver is responsive to those needs. They're quick to soothe the child if they're in distress. There was a lot of coming out of like unlearning some things of like, oh, don't spoil your baby, and like, you know, those kind of messages that maybe that's still getting perpetuated. I haven't heard that in a while, but it could be that that's still, those messages are still happening. It's absolutely better to respond to your baby's needs immediately. And learning to read and respond to infant and child cues, which we'll talk more about infant cues. Having quality and quantity time together. So like quantity does matter. You think like, oh, if I just have this one focused hour with my child once a week, that's enough. It's like, well, you kind of need both. That positive physical contact, hugging, singing, holding. Are they engaging in adult activities as well? You know, are you engaging in child-centered activities? Is there a balance? Engaging in play with the child, especially activities that support reciprocity, so that where there's a back and forth happening. So these are all things that, like, if that secure attachment is happening in a family, you'll see these things play out. Do you have anything to add about these, Belin?
Yeah, just wanted to mention the attachment theory and the different styles of attachment. There's secure attachment, anxious attachment. The child could be distant and reactive, avoidant, and fearful avoidant. So you know, now they're looking into like different ways that healthy attachment or unhealthy attachment has affected, or these things have affected healthy attachment. So gentle home birth, bonding during pregnancy. So one thing outside the hospital that we try and promote with attachment with both parents is the non-gestational parent bonding during pregnancy with the baby and the mom. So we include them. We usually have like hour-long appointments. We include them in the appointment. We give as much attention to them as we do the gestational parent. We try and interact. I know for myself, one of my favorite things to do is at the end of pregnancy, like in the 3rd trimester, have the non-gestational parent palpate the baby and feel the position of the baby. And, you know, the look on their face where they're like, wow, you can feel all of that. You can really like, you know, feel the back and where the butt is, and sometimes like the knee or foot. And they're like, oh, that's what I've been feeling jabbing me, or, you know, it's really awesome to like have that interaction and experience with families. So a lot of also what we do is teach the partners how to be doulas in any birth setting. So, you know, sometimes we do have to transport to the hospital, in which case they can still be supportive to their partner when that transport happens. But in the home birth setting, you know, it's just as important to have that support and give the partner education about how they can do that, you know, whether how to attend to their needs is a big factor in that. Immediate bonding and attachment process. So after a baby is born, we usually leave the cord intact. So we don't cut the cord. up to 2 hours after the baby's born. And the purpose for that is to not disrupt that attachment time. In the hospitals, it's referred to as the golden hour, where they're allowing the baby and the parents to bond together. And they do usually clamp and cut the cord after it stops pulsing, which, you know, there's reason for that we don't disrupt their bonding for up to 2 hours afterwards, and we really just try and let them be in their little bubble and non-disruptive as possible, taking vitals and, you know, checking on them to make sure everything's going smoothly. We just really want to give them that opportunity to just be in their little nucleus, you know, for those first couple of hours. For myself, one thing that I do is you know, we're talking about consent with children or with infants. And one thing that I do is when I do clamp and cut the cord, I welcome the baby. I tell them, welcome to being a land mammal, because, you know, in the uterus, we're surrounded in amniotic fluid. And so like we're a water mammal. And so I tell them, you know, welcome to this side, welcome to being a land mammal. I'm going to cut your cord and remove you from your placenta. You no longer need that nourishment. You're going to get your nourishment in a different way now through lactation. And, you know, a lot of the times you can just see the baby like settle into what's happening, being, you know, taken from their parent, not taken all the way. We usually do it on the mom. We'll kind of turn the baby. A lot of the times we let the non-gestational parent cut the cord. So, you know, there's a lot of those things that we do in the home birth setting that are really about bonding and attachment in those initial moments of life. Also in the home birth setting, we have a familiar and comfortable setting. So, you know, you're surrounded by your own microbes, you're surrounded by your own germs. You're not in a hospital that has the like sterilized and feel to it. You have all your own environment. And so, you know, it's gives you a little more immune boost to be in that environment, and as well as the baby. More self-directed and controlled. So in a home birth environment, you know, of course, we're being guided by the parents and what they want, and listening to their needs and adapting to those things. You know, we have a lot of conversations about if something comes up, the decision making is, you know, very much we give them the information, and then the parents will come back and tell us what it is that they've decided. Even with certain transport situations, if it's a non-emergent transport situation, we, you know, really give as much information to them as possible so that they can make that informed decision whether to stay home or if they're wanting to go to the hospital. A lot of those situations are, you know, maternal exhaustion, dehydration, pain medication. So we don't have pain medication at home. We do have water that is awesome, that sometimes can take the edge off, and that's all that's needed. Less invasive and unnecessary medical interventions. So again, that's all about the informed consent. The hospitals will usually, you know, put an IV, at least set it, if not start an IV right away when somebody gets to the hospital. And a lot of times that's not necessary. They do it as a way to work quickly if an emergency arises and they need to, you know, have things kind of set up so that they can move fast. You know, a lot of the times, like I said, that isn't necessary. We encourage people to eat and drink during labor. At the hospital, they don't want you to have anything to eat or drink once you're checked in. Increased chance of having a vaginal birth. So we you know, stay with our clients once they're in active labor, or sometimes sooner than that.
And to clarify, you can drink water in the hospital.
A lot of the times they won't allow water either, because if you have anesthesia, they don't want anybody to throw up. So they give you ice chips usually, or something like to wet your mouth. But to stay hydrated, you really got to drink a lot of water throughout labor. So it is a little different, but you're right, they do give you an increased chance of having a vaginal birth. We stay with our clients, you know, at home from you know, early on or active labor, and stay with them the duration of labor. And sometimes that can be up to 3 days or longer, you know. A lot of the times we're told that, or, you know, we're shown in movies or in media that, you know, the water breaks and all of a sudden the baby's born. And that's not always the case. Typically it's at least 18 hours of labor before a baby's born. That's pretty typical of most labors, not all labors. Some labors go really fast, you know, because we're there at home, really giving that encouragement and really giving the support that the mom needs to stick it out at home, instead of, you know, a lot of times in transition. So transition is like from 8 to 10 centimeters. A lot of the times we'll hear the parents say that they can't do it anymore. And, you know, that's kind of our cue to listen in and be like, okay, baby's getting close to crowning, you know, baby's really coming down the birth canal. And sometimes, you know, at the hospital that's misconstrued and like, okay, let's give you medication. Then those interventions that they give at the hospital can sometimes cause more harm than if they were to stay at home. Not always though, not always. There are a lot of hospital births that have good outcomes. Individualized care, you know, that just goes without saying, that we're focused on the client that we're with, and we're really listening to what their needs are. The skin to skin with baby afterwards, you know, like I mentioned earlier, that 2 hours of bonding time that we give, we really encourage like skin to skin during that time, including with the non-gestational parent. Just any time that they are holding the baby, to have their shirts off and be able to just have that, you know, the smells and the tastes and everything that the baby is taking in be available for them without detergents or, like, you know, clothing, the materials that we wear, polyester, cotton, whatever we're choosing, you know. Those little things we kind of don't think about them, but it's really important to have skin to skin. Higher rates of success, breast and chest feeding. So one of the things, because we do follow our clients through 6 weeks with both the gestational parent and the baby, we definitely, you know, have higher rates of success for nursing, because we're checking in on them. We have direct contact with them. If something comes up for them, if they have questions, we're doing interventions in certain intervals. So we see them in the postpartum period for a 24, 36-hour visit, a 3-day visit, a 1-week visit, a 2-week visit, sometimes a 4-week visit, depending on how they're both doing, and then the 6-week visit. So most of those are all at home. We go to them instead of asking them to come to us. And the 6-week visit is the final visit that they come back to our clinic and see us there. This is a picture of my daughter and my first grandchild. This is the skin to skin. And co-sleeping. Co-sleeping is another thing that, you know, a lot of people have questions about. and co-sleeping is really important for the nursing and bonding and attachment process. And it does help when the baby's waking up, you know, every 2 hours, just to have them near. You can just pop them on and they can get their belly full, go back to bed. Traditional support, family planning. Beata, did you want to talk about these?
Sure. So just also thinking about, there is another disparity of how Native families do. There is a trend of them coming into perinatal care later on in their pregnancy, but we were only moved to this culture of support like early on, to like where if you're wanting to start a family, like what can you do? Again, thinking about those intersections between environmental and reproductive health and the realities of where some of us live in proximity to polluted sites or contaminated sites, or with fracking or things like that. We might want to like do a detox before we get pregnant, you know, and so these are things that we can talk about, using that optimal nutrition from food as our medicine and our plants as that herbal support to get our uterus nice and toned, or there's so much that we could do in preparation, and even that spiritual and cultural and mental preparation that's needed. So how do we start to put those things back in place with our communities and like really promote that with young families or new families? Again, there's traditionally we had a lot of things that we would draw on culturally to support our perinatal health. And even our clothing and the way we would wear our babies on our bodies when they were born, those all played a role in their development. And having babies close to our bodies, it's shown that brain development is nurtured the longer we hold our children. You know, I think the average for American babies being held, which is shocking, is an hour a day. And you look at Indigenous communities globally, and it's 6 hours a day because we're doing that baby wearing. And so just think about like those contraptions that we think are really neat and entertaining for the babies, you know, to put them in. If they're overused, they can kind of disrupt some of those things and also cause some tightness and tension in babies' bodies, to where they might feel like really stiff, and they might need some extra help if they're in those devices too much. So the best thing is just to like have them and hold them. Again, we're emphasizing community support. Like, how do we brainstorm around this, you know, and reinvigorate those traditional support networks that we had. Moving into first foods, which is, you know, the first foods that they share with the gestational parent, and then to human milk, and then language. You know, we can let our babies hear their traditional languages when they're born, and integrating those things, and ceremonies, and you know, any other cultural practices that we have. And so moving into like some of the benefits, you know, that's body feeding has always been a traditional practice in our communities. And right now it's recommended that people chest feed for a year, but even that is based on American culture and not Indigenous cultures. We fed our babies for a lot longer. Thinking about that standard of what is the baseline for how what are like families messaging about their children. So a lot of even times the growth charts that those little curvy growth charts that we go for our well child checks, even those aren't based on BIPOC families or demographics. So these are things that we can start to shift and advocate for to change, that they're more culturally relevant and relevant to our communities and our body types and how we move and grow in the world. So just to like be critical of when you're getting information and messaging about how your baby's developing, or how you feed your child, or what best practice is, to just really like question those things. And let's see, let me get to that slide. Do you have anything to add about that, Belin?
Yeah, I was just gonna say the same thing about, you know, being aware that those charts and those statistics, don't come from our body types and our traditional, you know, ways, that they're, and not to judge ourselves, that, you know, based on those things. Just saying the same thing you said in a different way.
And so like feeding our babies, there's like so many positive health outcomes that it contributes to. And it actually lowers risk factors for both the lactating parent and the baby. So like for the baby, there's a decreased risk of SIDS, diabetes, obesity, heart disease, certain kinds of cancers. For the mom, it's like a decrease in reproductive cancers and type 2 diabetes. So the longer we're able to feed our children, then like these things get impacted in a good way. And again, it's optimal bonding and attachment for both parent and baby. And we could like encourage you, like there's lactation counselors, there's folks available that can go into these things really in depth. There's like so many more benefits. We're just touching on a few of them. Human milk as first foods. You want to start with this one?
Sure. So the infant physiology, you know, a lot of parents sometimes are concerned with, you know, their nose being pressed into the chest and not being able to breathe, but the babies are built to be able to nurse. Everything about them is created for that purpose. So, you know, there are, again, a lot, you know, this upcoming fad of the baby will crawl from your belly to your chest if you just leave them alone. You know, we've known that. All mammals do that, you know, all puppies, kittens, if you watch nature, you know, all mammals do that. And our people knew that. So I feel like, you know, there's certain things that are like, that's not new to us, but we've forgotten, and it's not normalized anymore. So babies are definitely built to nurse, and you know, they use their hands, kind of like knitting. Sometimes it seems like they're getting in the way of nursing, but they're actually feeling the difference between their hands and the nipple. And the nipple has oil on it that they can smell. So they're like learning about you just as much as you're learning about them. Success comes with lots of support. That's a very true statement. You know, there are a lot of people that, you know, they go through discomfort and pain, and nursing should not be painful. A lot of times it's positioning of the baby that causes nipple trauma or causes certain things to come up that are painful for the lactating parent. And you know, working with somebody like Beata said, a lactation counselor or a midwife or a doula that has lactation training, you know, there are a lot of supports from there as well as from family. It's really important that the family is behind the nursing parent, that they really are there to allow the gestating parent or the lactating parent that time to just be with the baby and not hold the baby, not ask to, you know, oh, let me hold them, let me feed them, but be very firm even in their own self of, no, I'm not here for that. I'm here to do the chores, you know, even if it's just coming in once a day to do the dishes, make sure that there's food, warm food for the parents, so that the newly postpartum parent isn't you know, having to do everything, because that really is disruptive for nursing. Other benefits of breastfeeding and body feeding is optimal nutrition. Beata, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, and we'll try and move through. I know we're getting short on time. So just optimal nutrition is like there's this exchange of biology and chemistry with like the baby's saliva in the milk, so that your baby is getting exactly what they need as they develop. And even it's really amazing, even with tandem nursing, if you're feeding more than one child at different ages, that exchange can signal your body in two different sides what nutrition is coming through. So it's really amazing. And again, with like first foods, like traditional foods and flavors can be distilled through the milk. And so how they're getting used to our traditional diets. And that infant palate, when they start to eat foods, that sets the foundation. So like really being careful not to introduce sweets too soon when they do start to eat solid foods. And thinking about like, what are those traditional foods that we start to offer children when they start to eat both. And so I wanted to talk more about infant cues, so that you know what we're talking about. So infant cues, it's how babies communicate their needs. And it could be if they're tired, if they're hungry, if they're overstimulated, if they're ready to play, if they need a break, like it's how they communicate. And it can be really subtle messaging. And so it could be like changes in skin color, hiccups, changes in breathing, their respiration gets faster or slower. Sometimes they can just like start looking away. And so if you're playing with a baby and they start looking away, like just kind of stopping and like giving them a minute till like they look back at you and they signal that readiness. Yawns, sometimes like they're flailing limbs, or like if they have their hands outstretched like they want you. But if they're like startle reflex, sometimes that can be dysregulation. Arching of their back or body arching, ear grabbing, sometimes that can signal like an earache or ear infection or just discomfort. If they start sucking on their hands or on their lips. And then as they get more and more dysregulated, then that can tend to go into fussing and crying. So if a baby is crying, it's because a lot of these cues were missed and they got to that point already. And then it might be a little bit harder to bring them back down to a regulated, calm state once they're already at that point. Eye rubbing, and then sometimes if it's really overstimulating, sometimes, or if they've just had enough, they'll just check out and go to sleep. And think about this as adults, like we do these same things. You know, and I think about when a baby's born, I like to compare it to like when you walk into a casino and there's all those that like lights and bells, and it's hard even for a grown-up. And so for a child and an infant, it's even more magnified. So the more we can like tone down the environment that the baby's in, and slowly introduce stimulation, that's usually better in helping them to regulate. And it's teaching them that we're paying attention to these things. And that's part of that body sovereignty of how we're responding to those needs. It's like promoting security by helping the baby feel understood. And so when a baby is ready to engage, they'll have wide, bright eyes, they'll make eye contact and smile. Their movements are more smooth, cooing, talking, grasping at your hands, things like that. So learning how to tell when they're ready to like play or is like that readiness cues. And how we can promote healthy touch after birth. Again, we talked a lot about the skin to skin postpartum, honoring the postpartum period. You know, it's there, we're having to go against capitalism again with like, it's grossly inadequate how fast birthing parents are expected to return back to work. And traditionally, a lot of cultures, we have that 40-day period where like all that was expected was you lay in, you rest, you heal, you bond with your baby, you establish healthy chest feeding and successful chest feeding, and then they're able to engage more with outside community after that. So think about, you know, like our cultural practices. Again, infant massage is great. It's a great, I recommend going with a trained professional because there is a lot to learn around practicing consent and reading baby cues if you're doing massage on your baby. it is a way to remedy if there was disrupted attachment, or if like in instances of adoption or things like that, like where you're kind of catching up, or if there was like some birth trauma where there was separation, it is possible to remedy these things through some of these practices. And sometimes baby just needs a little attention and more practice with that healthy touch, and then they get back on track. Cranial sacral is a great approach to correcting some of these things. Partner education and support, and then herbal support if that's needed to help with lactation.
Yeah, with craniosacral, that can really help with if there was birth trauma, if the baby was born really fast, or it took a long time for the baby to come through the birth canal. Sometimes we see tightening of muscles and really the baby is tense, and the craniosacral really helps to the baby kind of unwind and loosen all of those things from the birthing experience. So I just wanted to throw that in a little bit about the craniosacral.
You want to go into the slide?
Sure, yeah. So considerations if unable to body feed. So if you have a client, clients that are unable to body feed for whatever reason, sometimes there's a hypoplasia of the tissues that don't allow, they don't have any ducts to create milk. Or if there's a client that's a transgender person, there's milk donors. Pumping can help with lactation problems if the person is lactating. Supplements, formula can be a healthy alternative. Research what kind is best for your baby. Goat milk is also common in some places to give to infants. Combination of chest and bottle feeding. SNS, or the supplemental nursing system, can also be something. So if the parent wants the baby to latch onto their nipple, there are these really cool inventions where there's like a little pouch that you fill with the milk or formula, and you put a tube. It's a really small tube that you can put and attach to the nipple, and the baby latches on to that. And so that can be something that's really helpful for attachment and bonding if they're really wanting to have that time together. And this is a resource list of some of the places. If you're looking for more information, you can contact us at Birth of My Heart, Changing Women Initiative, Tewa Women United,
Indigenous Women's Health and Reproductive Freedom Program.
New Mexico Breastfeeding Task Force, New Mexico WIC, Las Cubres Learning Services.
And they're for assessments. If you have concerns about disrupted attachment or development, they have some really great assessments that they can do with your child from a young age. So that's why we added them on. New Mexico FACE program, Navajo Breastfeeding Coalition, Indigenous Milk Medicine Collective is putting on this awesome Native Breastfeeding Week. And then local midwives, counselors, birth centers, and our oral traditions. And I'm sure there's many more folks. Feel free to drop them in the chat if you have other resources to offer.
We went a little longer, but we are open for questions or comments. And if you do want to email us, there's also that option.
So there's a question from Angel. Thank you. What does good policy look like at the tribal, state, federal levels to support the sustainability of Indigenous birth workers? I think right now, career pathways for Indigenous communities to come into birth work as a profession would be great, like scholarship support, housing support for students, maybe having developing resolutions in your tribal communities in support of local birth centers or birth workers is something we're looking at doing in the near future for Birth of My Heart. On a state level, breaking through the certification process as a barrier for our communities, to where we should be allowed to have our own traditional standards for certification. And what that means for us, for someone to be certified. You know, we should be able to develop that as tribal communities. On a federal level, it's funding. It's always going to be funding. But also, like, looking at reimbursement with Medicaid, there's a lot of discussion and dialogue happening now about Medicaid reimbursement and making sure that it's just not creating further barriers for around certifications and things like that. But also looking at birth work as like a whole natural system, you know, and how it works in tandem with environmental health, how it works in tandem with other community supports around behavioral and mental health, and addiction and recovery support, and all of these factors that can impact parenting in our communities, that like there's a lot of disparities around these things. So it's also, I think, that intersectional work of looking at our community's health and wellness as a whole, and where those gaps are. Do you have anything to add about that? I'll think about the next part of good policy. What does good policy look like for parents, especially young parents?
Yeah, so the young parents, I know of a couple different things. So we have a young parents group that works with Young Women United. Wait, no, Bold Futures. They're called Bold Futures now. They have worked on some policies for New Mexico. My daughter is a young parent advocate for National Crintonton. So she is like in this national organization, and they have herself and a few other Native advocates that are working on policy nationally. You know, to answer good policy specifically, I think that it's still a work in progress. I think that there's still a lot of conversation that needs to be had about what that means, because even from my generation to my daughter's generation, there's so many changes that have happened, and the work that needs to be done is really up to the youth to bring it to us so that we can work together.
And also having a birth center in every tribal community is way overdue. Restoring, like we talked a lot about the extraction of this knowledge, the taking of this, those things need to be put back. And so that includes like language learning programs. Think of everything that cultural disruption that we talked about, putting those things back in place. You know, doing away with blood quantum at all levels is huge as well, of our ability to reclaim our children as our own, and our cultural practices, and within our community, that is not a barrier to education or healthcare or anything like that anymore.
Thank you, Beata and Belin, for sharing all of your wonderful and tremendous knowledge with us today. If there's more questions, please put them in the chat. But we would like to close up for today. I know Jolene had to take care of something, but yeah, we are very grateful to have you here today. And one of the biggest lessons or learnings that I had from our time together is that intersectional learning that you mentioned, Beata, of how birth work is part and perhaps maybe the beginning of how we reclaim our bodies, and therefore reclaim our communities and our knowledge, and seeing how I think Saya Kathy talks about this a lot, about how we're born into this culture of violence. And I think reclaiming ourselves and reclaiming our knowledge is entering that place of culture of peace and culture of love for our communities that we come from. And so I wanted to leave you all today with this food for thought. In my journey as a birth worker and learning, I'm realizing that this journey, I'm like 27 years old, but it's gonna be lifelong for me, and this journey of healing as well. And one of the biggest things that is current in my life is healing from a lot of childhood stuff, a lot of stuff that I have with my parents and my grandparents and my family. And one of those things is learning about the birth stories of myself, my siblings, and my family. And it all kind of starts there, it starts small. And in the same way that we work, you know, with the seeds, it's questioning how these seeds were connected to the different generations of our family and our communities. So yeah, I encourage you all to just think about that and maybe start questioning what those birth stories are in your family or whatever is comfortable with you. It's really exciting, and it's a really great opportunity to learn how we heal on the individual level, so we can heal for our communities and hold that space for our communities. So I hope that makes sense. I don't know. Sometimes I have all these thoughts and I'm like, I don't know how to like put them in one.
Yes, thank you. That's a great note to end on. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you all for joining us. And if there's any questions or comments, please leave them in the chat, but feel free to enjoy the rest of your Monday.